Jack lives in a quiet suburb, and Halloween is approaching. He decides to add some festive decorations to his home. In a local antique shop, he discovers a vintage clown doll. Although it's a bit worn, its strange allure is irresistible. After bringing the doll home, Jack places it on a shelf in the living room. Everything seems normal at first, but soon he notices strange occurrences. Objects moving around the house, doors opening by themselves, and he feels like the doll's eyes are following him. One night, Jack's phone frequently warns him about rapid battery drainage. Upon checking the background, he discovers an unknown app consuming a lot of power. This app cannot be uninstalled, and its icon is the image of the clown doll. Jack grows suspicious of the doll, especially its eyes. One night, he thinks he sees a faint red glow coming from them as he returns home late. Feeling uneasy, he decides to inspect the doll and discovers tiny cameras embedded in its eyes. He realizes that this is not an ordinary toy, but a surveillance device. Upon further investigation, he finds that he has been monitored for months, with similar cameras installed in every room of his house. Jack decides to confront the shop owner at the antique store. However, when he returned to the antique shop, he found that it had closed down. A "For Rent" sign hung on the door, and the shop appeared abandoned for quite some time. Jack was baffled, and things started to feel increasingly eerie. A few days later, Jack began to feel uneasy, as if someone was constantly following him on the street or on his way home. Every time he turned around, he saw nothing, just empty streets and passing strangers. His anxiety grew as if someone was secretly watching him. One night, Jack was suddenly awakened by a strange noise. He heard someone fiddling with his door handle, as if trying to force their way inside. Thankfully, he had locked the door. Heart racing, he got up and looked out the window, where he saw a shadowy figure in the yard under the faint moonlight. The figure, with messy hair and erratic movements, seemed to be lurking and watching his house. Terrified, Jack immediately called the police. They arrived quickly, and after a brief search, they caught a disheveled, middle-aged woman in Jack's yard. She seemed mentally unstable, her behavior erratic and strange. As the police escorted her to the car, she smiled at Jack and said, "I've liked you for so long. That doll was a gift from me. Do you like it?" Jack was stunned to realize that the mysterious clown doll had come from this admirer. The woman had been secretly watching him for a long time. The police later informed Jack that the woman suffered from a severe mental illness and had been obsessed with Jack, using the doll to spy on his daily life. We never expected that the decision that night would turn into a nightmare we couldn't escape. That Halloween, my best friend Jack and I had just turned 14. We felt we were too old to go trick-or-treating, so we decided to do something more thrilling. Explore the supposedly haunted, abandoned farm. The farm was some distance from our town. We had heard many rumors about the place. It used to be a farmer's home, but he suddenly disappeared decades ago, leaving the house abandoned. Later, people claimed the farmer didn't disappear, but died on the farm under mysterious circumstances. We were skeptical of these stories, but since it was Halloween night, we wanted a real thrill. At dusk, we grabbed our flashlights and rode our bikes down the path to the farm. As we moved further away from the town, the surrounding lights gradually disappeared. Although we claimed not to believe in these ghost stories, our hearts raced uncontrollably when we stood in front of the dilapidated farm gate. The iron gate creaked as if it might collapse at any moment. The sky had completely darkened, and the cold wind rustled through the weeds, sounding eerily like whispers. "Are you sure you want to go in?" I asked tentatively. Jack smiled, but I could tell he was nervous too. "Of course. Are you scared?" I didn't reply, but the unease in my heart kept growing. We parked our bikes outside and walked in, the ground beneath our feet soft and slippery. Looking up, the layout of the farm was simple. Large stretches of abandoned farmland surrounded a lonely little house, with straw haphazardly piled on the ground like an unkempt graveyard. Occasionally, we could see a few half-toppled scarecrows in the fields, swaying slightly in the wind as if they were watching our every move. The small house had clearly been abandoned for years. Its walls were peeling, the window panes were shattered, and vines covered the roof. The wooden front door hung ajar, creaking softly, as if inviting us in. Jack and I exchanged a glance and stepped inside. The air inside was damp, mixed with the smell of rotting wood. The floor creaked under our feet, and dust floated lazily in the beams of our flashlights. There wasn't much inside, just a few discarded broken chairs and a cracked wooden table lying in the corner. A few faded picture frames hung on the walls, as if telling stories of a once prosperous past. Suddenly, I heard faint footsteps. The sound didn't seem to come from inside the house. I instinctively held my breath and listened. The footsteps were getting closer, like the soft crunch of someone stepping on straw. I thought it was Jack playing a trick, but when I turned, I saw him standing beside me, his face full of confusion. I followed the sound and looked outside the front door. My heart raced. There, in the nearby field, stood a figure. When the flashlight's beam hit it, I saw the terrifying pumpkin face. A massive pumpkin head mask with a twisted grin carved into it. In his hand was a rusty, long knife, and the moonlight reflected coldly off the blade. "Oh my God," I whispered. Jack's face turned pale in an instant. "We need to get out of here." He grabbed my arm in a panic. I swallowed my fear and pulled Jack, running towards the back of the house. The back door was even more dilapidated than the front, barely hanging on its hinges. We pushed it open and bolted outside. Before us lay an even more desolate field, with weeds almost reaching knee-high. The scarecrows in the distance seemed to come alive in the darkness, silently watching us. Worse, the field stretched endlessly, and every direction looked the same. "Where do we run?" Jack asked anxiously. I looked around, my mind in chaos. Just then, heavy footsteps came from inside the house, as if someone was slowly approaching. Panic drove us to keep running, regardless of direction, just wanting to get away from that terrifying pumpkin-headed man. The farther we ran, the more uneven the ground became, with the straw growing higher, constantly whipping against our faces and arms. The field seemed endless, surrounded by identical straw, making it impossible to discern direction. We were completely lost, our hearts pounding as if they would leap out of our chests. I raised the flashlight, my hand trembling, illuminating a small area ahead. Suddenly, the light swept across that pumpkin face. He was right there. The grin on the pumpkin face looked even more terrifying in the dark, and the blade slowly raised in his hand. I desperately grabbed Jack's hand and started running again. Fear and despair flooded our minds. We felt trapped in an endless nightmare. I don't know how long we ran, but just as we were about to lose hope, we suddenly heard the faint sound of wheels and the roar of an engine ahead. It was the main road of the town. We ran desperately toward that direction. Our leg muscles felt numb, but we couldn't stop, fearing that the pumpkin-faced man would catch up with us at any moment. We burst out of the fields, and in front of us was a familiar road along with our parked bicycles, with faint lights flickering at the end of the street. Jack and I collapsed on the ground, hardly believing we had escaped alive. I gasped for breath, looking back at the fields we had fled from, but there was nothing. The pumpkin-headed man seemed to have never existed.